I'm Tim Markhurst. I'm head of the Centre for Journalism, and you're not going to have to put up with me for very long at all. Tonight's discussion and the presentation that will precede it exists to celebrate the memory of a really great journalist. So can I start by reminding everybody that this is the Bob Friend Memorial Lecture. Bob Friend, the original face of Sky News, was a hugely talented public service journalist who delivered his work with life-enhancing warmth and a sense of humour that made him hugely popular with his audience and with his colleagues. And the Centre for Journalism is very proud to be associated with him, and we're also proud of our association with Sky News, which sponsors the scholarship. Now, before we introduce the 2015 Bob Friend Memorial Scholar, I'd like to welcome some very special guests, the Friend family. Bob's widow married, his daughters Claire and Lisa, and his granddaughters Alison and Jess are all with us. Welcome, thank you very much for being here tonight. I'd also like to welcome my colleagues from the University of Kent's Executive Group, the Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor David Nightingale, and Deputy Vice Chancellor Denise Everett, and my boss John Whiteman, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'd also like to welcome Joanne Butcher, Chief Executive of the National Council for Training of Journalists, by which we are very proud to be accredited, Geraldine Allinson, Chairman of the KM Group, and another special friend of the Centre for Journalism, Rob Kirk, former Director of Editorial Development at Sky News, who set up this scholarship and helped to make it such a success. So Rob, thank you for being here with us again tonight. I'd also like to welcome some excellent local schools. So to staff and students from Bryn and Lark, Rochester Grammar, Kent College and King's Rochester, thank you all for being with us. Our first objective tonight is to award that scholarship, the 7th Annual Bob Friend Memorial Scholarship. The scholarship awards the scholar with a 4-week work placement at Sky News, during which they work across the range of Sky's output, including radio and online journalism as well as television. It pays a cash prize of £3,500, which is immensely useful in this era of high tuition fees. And it's a fantastic opportunity for a student with the ambition and ability to succeed in journalism. Several years ago, 3 I think, we received early confirmation of its value when the 2009 scholar Alan McGuinness got a full-time job as a reporter, one of our first graduates from the first cohort in the centre. Alan joined the KM Group's Medway Messenger title. He now works at Sky News. Also this night is 2011 Bob Friend Scholar Tanya Steer. Tanya is a reporter with the Daily Mail. And the 2012 Bob Friend Scholar, Gemma Collins, is also with us. Gemma is a reporter with KMTV, the new television station for Kent, which is jointly owned by the KM Group and the University of Kent, and located here on the Medway campus in new broadcast studios which we've just built. Of course, such prizes should not come easily. So, like everything we do in the Centre for Journalism, this scholarship is about academic and editorial merit. Admissions to our degree are intensely competitive, and the competition for the scholarship is even tougher. Applicants are required to submit proposals for a multimedia treatment of a story for Sky News. Shortlisted candidates at current affairs and spelling test before they're interviewed by a panel consisting of representatives of Sky News, the Friend family and the University of Kent. And to introduce this year's winner, please welcome the first of several very senior journalists we're privileged to have with us tonight, the head of Sky News, John Ryley.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening, everybody. The Bob Friend Memorial Scholarship is a great success. The scholarship is a wonderful tribute to Bob Friend, a superb journalist. I worked with him. A good bloke. One of Bob's favourite phrases was, he's a good bloke. You didn't want to hear what he said if you weren't a good bloke. And he was a great colleague to some of us here tonight in Chatham. The scholarship is also an opportunity to make a difference in these tough times, to help a budding journalist. And the scholarship also means we get to hear from some outstanding editorial figures at the award ceremony. My big thanks go to those who make it such a success. Bob's family, the University of Kent, Sky, and critically, the students who compete for the award. This year, 4 students made the tough shortlist. The runners-up were Adnan Deveni, Madeline Hanson, and Evangeline Dryden. They deserve our congratulations. Each would have made a good scholar. But like many things in life, there is only one prize, one scholarship. And the panel was unanimous in agreeing that it should be awarded to a truly exceptional student. I'm delighted to announce that the winner of the 2015 Bob Friend Memorial Scholarship is Boglarka Kosztolanyi. So do go and they can see the game. Thank you. Congratulations. Well done, and the very best of luck to you in your career. This evening, in a manner I think that Bob might have appreciated, might have even approved, we're going to break with tradition, challenge convention, upset the status quo a little bit. In the past, the speakers, the likes of Mark Thompson, then Director General of the BBC, Sky's Alex Crawford, and Jon Snow from Channel 4, have given set-piece speeches. Tonight is different. Different because it's going to be a discussion rather than a lecture. Different because our interviewee is usually a special interviewer. And different because we have 2 extraordinary journalists, not just the usual one. I'm delighted that John Humphrys is here. John is a true colossus of news and current affairs journalism in the United Kingdom, on radio and television. 50 years of broadcast journalists, no mean feat that. What makes John so formidable is that he has, I believe, a tough reasonableness beneath the slight lyric grace. John tonight will be listening to the questions, and listening to the answers will be Sky's editor-at-large, Adam Boulton. Adam once doorstepped the Queen. No mean feat that either. Enjoy the evening, enjoy the discussion, enjoy the conversation. Over to you, Adam.
Well, never mind. Queen, as you all know, John Humphrys finished off the Director General of the BBC in one interview, so...
Yeah, spot the difference.
Was that a high point?
Getting my boss sacked? No, it was a curiously sad engagement, in a way. I mean, I'd gone into the interview, for those of you who can't remember, the boss, the DG, had only been in his job for 40-odd days and was in very serious trouble because of the McAlpine affair, the Jimmy Savile business, the whole thing all came together in one great explosion. And he handled it, well, I was going to say he handled it badly. That wasn't so much the problem. He didn't handle it. So we had a very distinguished bloke in Lord McAlpine, a blameless individual. Well, he'd been a political figure, so I don't suppose anybody in politics is blameless, but nonetheless, he'd done nothing wrong. And we effectively, the BBC effectively accused him of being a paedophile. Well, you know, that's not good by any standards. Certainly, given that he was entirely innocent, and given that we didn't actually make rudimentary checks. We behaved irresponsibly, cavalierly, shamefully, and I don't think anybody now would argue with that. At the time, although it was fairly obvious that all of that was the case, he didn't do anything about it. At least he didn't do what he should have done. And the crisis grew, and on a particular Saturday morning, 2 years ago, he appeared in front of me on the Today programme. Now, I expected to get from him, as you would, I expected to get the usual senior figure in the BBC nonsense, which is to say, oh, yes, no, that's a jolly good question, John, but, you know, I think what you've got to understand is that when you're running an organisation like the BBC, and, you know, this goes on and on and on, and 10 minutes later you're sort of dozing off a little bit and wondering if he's ever going to answer the question, which, of course, he never does. But he did not deal with it like that. George didn't. He was honest and straightforward. And when eventually I said to him with incredulity, which is understating it, you didn't actually see the programme, the Newsnight programme, that caused the problems, he said, no. And I said, why? And he said, I was doing something else. And at that moment, he was sitting opposite me in the studio, and at that moment it was obvious, I think, certainly it was obvious to the audience, certainly obvious to me anyway, that was it. It was all over for
I mean, credit to the BBC that he did it on your channel.
Absolutely.
Going in, you and the editors, did you think this was a make or break? This was a crunch interview for the DG?
No, I thought it highly unlikely, inconceivable, that the Director General would have agreed to do this interview if he had not got a solid defence. I mean, you wouldn't, would you? You wouldn't go on the Today programme at the height of a crisis like this without having a defence, without sitting down with your advisors. Now, what's Humphrys going to ask me? Right, okay, we can do this, 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 and this. This is the tack, this is the strategy, blah, 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 blah. I've been there you've been there 1,000 times with politicians, haven't you? And so have I. And I expected that to be the case. But he had no defence. He was banged to rights. A, he was banged to rights. B, he knew he was banged to rights. C, he was prepared to run that risk because he was accountable. And for once in the BBC, we found the big boss actually putting himself in the position where he was hugely vulnerable, knew he was hugely vulnerable, but nonetheless felt he should do it. And he did it, and it cost him it. Now, look, did it cost him his job? Would he have had to go anyway? I strongly suspect he would. But that was the point at which it was perfectly... Well, he went from me. He went from the... I know this because the driver, we shared a driver, and he took him directly from me to Broadcasting House, which was where he set about having his meetings, and then a few hours later resigned. But I tell you what, there was no... And the huge credit to him for this, there was no anger towards me. There was no sense at that time or at any time since in the years that followed that he felt he'd been stitched up. He as he walked out of the... And I thought this was immensely touching, and I'm not easily touched. I finished the interview and I said, thank you very much, and off he went. And he walked out of the studio, and at the studio door, he opened the door, and then he paused, and we were then live in the studio, so he couldn't say anything. We were doing the paper review, whatever it was. And he held the door open, and then he came back in, and he leaned across the desk and held out his hand and shook my hand and gave me one of those... Well, it wasn't a smile so much as a grimace and a kind of slight nod of the head. And my driver told me subsequently that he got in the car and the guy he was with, the then marketing director, I hope he's not working for Sky now, he's certainly not working for the BBC any longer, said to George, fucking Humphrys, and stitched you up. And George said, no, he was doing his job. You know, fair play, as we say in Wales.
Right, well, we'll come on to the Today programme, or back to the Today programme, rather, as we have a discussion. I should say that the plan tonight is that John and I are going to talk for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll take questions. So all you budding journalists and all you haters of journalists in the audience, sharpen your questions now. But I want to start actually sort of almost away from journalism as the heir to Magnus Magnusson, because I have faced you in Mastermind.
Should we tell him how you did? Yeah, he did very well.
Okay, I'll go for that. Was that, after your long career as a serious journalist, a foreign correspondent, a newsreader, was it a challenge to you to be something that you thought, should I do this? Will it damage my credibility?
I didn't think it would damage my credibility. I did say no when they sent me an email. I got an email one day, 13 years ago, to say, will you do Mastermind? And I instantly emailed back to say no. And I got another one repeating the same request. And I instantly emailed back and said no. And then I got a call, wow, from the controller of light entertainment at the BBC. Wow. And he said, why won't you chair Mastermind? And I said, oh, chair Mastermind. Because I thought they wanted me to do what you braved. Nothing would get me into that black chair. So then I, immediately... What was your specialty subject? Well, it wouldn't be, because I wouldn't do it, I tell you. Listen, on one occasion, and this is one of the contenders on our celebrity thing, the one that you did, chose me as her specialist subject. And I challenged her on one of the answers, and she said, no, and she was right and I was wrong. So there's no way. Anyway, I said yes. And, I said yes once they told me how much money they're... that's not for... Yeah. I tell you what, best thing I've ever done, madam. How long have you been interviewing politicians?
30 years.
Yep, much the same as me, 30 years. And I tell you, to be asking people questions, knowing that they want to answer them, is a wonderful change, I tell you.
And they do take it very seriously.
Oh, God, they do. Oh, they do. And on Celebrity Mastermind, you do get some bizarre, not you, not you. You do get some bizarre, in fact, I'll test you, all right, a little bit of a test for you, because you're all clever here, you are. Well, you're at university, aren't you? Oh, must be clever. This is Celebrity Master. This first one is dead easy, all right? Very, very easy. Actually, looking around at your ages, you may not know. Anyway, I'll try it. What the hell? It was a soap opera star who was doing the sitting in the chair bit. And the first question in the general knowledge round was, are you ready for this? What breakfast cereal do you associate with prison? All the adults will get it. I mean, all the adults, Come on, answer, quick. Porridge, exactly, porridge, of course it is. What did he say? Cheerios. I couldn't decide whether he was offering a sort of profound comment on our failed penal system, or whether he was just bloody thick. I discovered he was bloody thick. But anyway, but a few more. All right, three very quick ones, and these were not asked of a soap opera star. There was a senior political figure in the chair. Odd, isn't it, how politicians even want to go on Celebrity Mastermind? But they do. And this guy, I'll tell you his name when I finished asking you the questions. Slightly more difficult than the porridge one, I grant you, but nonetheless, not impossible. Well, obviously not. And they were as follows. I'll give you three of them. Who succeeded Henry VIII? Edward VI, thank God. I've been embarrassing if none of you know.
I've been this person.
You can't be. You're not allowed to say it, no. Edward VI is correct. His answer, however, who succeeded Henry VIII, was Henry VII. What was the name of this is all true, I'm not making any, even though I'm a journalist, I'm not making any of this up. What was the name of the prison in Paris that they stormed in 1789? Not Versailles. And the surname of the lady called Marie who discovered radiation. Not Antoinette. And the guy who offered all of those answers and many more like them was a bloke called David Lammy. Yes.
Who wants to be Mayor of London?
Who wants to be Mayor of London, and who was at the time, this is what I particularly enjoyed about it, Her Majesty's Minister of State for Higher Education. So what's not to like?
I mean, I have to say, I didn't get any easy questions, but the people I was up against...
You didn't pay enough, you know.
They got asked, what colour are the berries at Christmas, and what colour is Terra Masalata?
You remember this?
Well, I do.
That's a bit worrying, Adam.
Well, it's not exactly mastermind, that, is it?
No. It's celebrity. Look, they're there for the celebrity rather than the mastermind bit, if you see what I mean, with the exception of you. We had to have some heavyweight there as well, in every...
OK, now here we are in a school of journalism. University School of Journalism. They didn't have those back in your day?
They did not. No, they did not. Well, even if I'd been capable of going to one, I didn't. I started off on a local newspaper, which was the only way you, pretty much in those days, because as John said, he was kind, actually. He said 50 years. It's slightly longer. Yes, I started when I was 15, and I'm now 71. So what's that? 50. Anybody do that? What?
56 years.
Bloody hell. I didn't realise it was that long. Good God. 56 years ago. And that was pretty much the only way you could do it. There were no training schemes as such, even on the local, on the national newspapers. Thomson was beginning, well, it wasn't Thomson when I started out, but when it became Thomson, when he took over, they did start with, I think that was the first training scheme for journalists. But when I started, there was no such thing, and I did what you had to do pretty much in those days, unless you had friends in high places, which I didn't, coming from Splot. Nobody has friends in Splot. That's a suburb of Cardiff, by the way. A suburb, inner city, bit of Cardiff. And I went to my local newspaper when I left school at 15. And
why did you want to be a journalist?
That's an embarrassing question, actually. I would like to say because I saw great injustices in the world and vowed to right them and hold power to account and stuff like that. All of that. It's humiliatingly not any of those things. It's because when I was a kid, we didn't have books in the house. It wasn't that sort of, well, you didn't very much then. It was post-war, very, very soon after the war. And what we did have were old American comics, because they used to send, I never quite understood this, but the Americans sent across, all came from America, as ballast in the ship's holds to Liverpool, huge, huge numbers of old comics, and we used to be able to buy them, secondhand, obviously, for whatever it was, penny a piece or something. And I used to love Superman comics. And Superman, and we're talking about me at the age of sort of 5 or 6, Superman, as we all know, was Clark Kent, right? Yes, Clark Kent was a journalist, right? And I thought, with my 5 or 6-year-old brain, oh, that's the way to become Superman, is to become... Now, fine at the age of 5 or 6, but at 50? Anyway, that really is I'm afraid it's as embarrassing as that. And I never, ever wanted to be anything other than a reporter, ever. Ever, not for a moment.
And what did people think of reporters then?
They barely knew they existed. I mean, journalism, do you know what? I know this will sound silly. I don't think I heard the word journalism used for about 20 years. I mean, journalists now have a special position in society. I really believe that in those days they were tradesmen and women. Well, actually, not really women. There were very, very, very few women in the business in those days. Very few. It was a man's job. If I tell you that at that time, the great newspaper, easily the greatest newspaper in this, put aside the Times for different reasons, because that's all that, and put aside the Guardian, although the Guardian wasn't very great, and it was the Manchester Guardian then anyway. But the great newspaper was the Express. Hard to think that now, eh?
I like to talk about the weather.
Quite. Anyway, it was Express. And so that gives you sort of... I mean, it was a great campaigning newspaper, and the Mirror was also a great campaigning newspaper. And people sort of knew about newspapers because... I'm talking about my sort of people, you know, not posh people who lived in... you know, semi-detached houses, but I'm talking about the kind of people who lived in splot. We were barely aware of what newspapers did, apart from the fact, you know, there was an evening newspaper, The Echo. There was the Western Mail, which was far too posh for us, and there was the Express, and that was it. So what people thought about reporters and journalists, I have no idea. I don't think they did think about them. They didn't. There wasn't much media, and the word media didn't exist. I mean, nobody, you know, obviously nobody. The word literally, I think, apart from. You know,
but you didn't think it was a posh thing to do?
God, no. Oh, God, no. Oh, no. And in fact, I spent the first probably year on the Penarth Times, which was the local paper that I went to, doing things like, there was a strike, a printer's strike, when I joined the paper, and we kept going because we printed it with, and I'm now talking to people who won't have the vaguest idea what I mean, but one of those machines you will remember, where you turn a handle, and you know you fill a cylinder with ink, and you wrap you wrap a sort of stylus around the cylinder, and you turn a handle and print the thing page by page, and then and my job was, because the paper stuck to the roller all the time, my job was to have a flit gun, which we used to use to kill flies with, and fill it with water and squirt it on the roller. So that was how I made my breakthrough. It's been downhill ever since.
And how did you move from there to the BBC?
Went to a slightly bigger local newspaper, the Merthyr Express, when I was 17, in the Valleys. And then went down to the Western Mail, got offered a job on the Western Mail. Then got a call from Thomson's to say, would I, the editorial director of Thomson's, John Gay Davis, I think his name was. Anyway, he told me that they were bringing in to the Sunday Times, introducing on the Sunday Times, a new feature called Insight. And would I be interested in becoming a member of the team? And I said, gosh, yes. How exciting. Well, he's going to come up and have lunch and we'll see what you're made of, as it were. So I went up to London to have lunch. I'd only been to London twice in my life. Neither time did I have lunch. We didn't have lunch, we had dinner. Lunch was what you had. Anyway, posh people had lunch. And I'm sorry if I'm overdoing the pop, but I'm, you know, why not? And I got taken to Simpson's in the Strand by Cudlip, who was a nasty piece of work, and somebody else, whose name I've now forgotten, and agreed over lunch at Simpson's that I would join them. And I was 21, and went back to London, back to Cardiff, went to the pub, and a few of my mates were there, including a chap called Norman Rees, who'd just gone to join TWW, and I told him, I said, I'm going to join the Sunday Times. He said, you don't want to do that. Telly's where it's at. And he was the deputy news editor for TWW, which was a local radio television station way back. Why don't you do that? And I said, all right then. So I rang them the next day, the Times, Sunday Times, and said, I'm not coming after all. And they said, you will never work in this town again. And years later, I was writing a column for the Sunday Times. So that was it. And then I went to the BBC, and yeah.
And I mean, making that change from print to radio and television, was that a big shock?
I don't think it was. I mean, you're still doing the same job, aren't you? I mean, you're reporting. And that's what I did. I mean, I was a reporter. And whether you're reporting for television, radio, newspapers, no difference, I think. You were treated rather differently. You were awfully special if you walked around. In fact, Michael Burke tells me to this day, who's not much younger, but is a bit younger than me. And he said he decided that he really wanted to join television because he was a local newspaper reporter as well. And he said he saw me one day standing doing a piece to camera with a clipboard. And it was the clipboard that did it for Burke. He said, I just wanted to have a kind of job where I could stand with a clipboard.
I can't see you going into the jungle there.
With a clipboard?
No, like Michael Burke.
Oh, you mean... What? Listen, I was asked about 10, 11 years ago, and they rang me. I can remember, well, I won't go into too much detail, but I was in the bathroom at the time. And they said, what have you done? I said, obviously my first question was, how much? And they told me, I think it was 10 years ago. So anyway, it was a huge amount. It was sort of like huge, £75,000 or something like that. And I said, oh, nothing like enough. And then they said, oh, well, that's only a negotiating figure, I'm sure. So I thought, well, anyway. And then I thought, come on. So I said, yeah, all right, yeah, okay. And they said, really? And I said, yeah, no problem. And they said, yeah, just like that. I said, yeah, no problem. So long I had one condition. And they said, yes, what's that? Sure, there'll be no problem. And I said, Tony Blair will have to come with me. And so they never asked again. No, I wouldn't go into, of course not.
Would you have gone if Tony Blair had said, I'm up for it?
Well, yeah, I could have saved the Iraq War, could have changed the world, couldn't I?
Because the Tony Blair operation actually conducted a sting on you to a certain extent.
Yeah, they did. Yes. Alistair Campbell, God rot his soul. And Tim, what's his name? Tim Allen. God rot his soul as well, although he's frightfully rich and powerful now, isn't he?
Yeah, he runs a company called Portland. Yeah. He worked for Sky for a bit.
Yeah, well, we've had rogues working for us as well, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Yeah, they did. They did a number on me. I opened the Times one morning, Saturday morning, to see a 2-page spread, and the headline across it said, every word, well, that bit anyway sticks in my mind. Humphrys says all Labour cabinet ministers are liars. Now, you might think that, not that I do as it happens, but even if you did, as a BBC radio presenter, you couldn't say that, because if you did, it would be tantamount to saying, I am offering my resignation. Of course, I didn't say that. But what they'd done was they illicitly got hold of a tape of what was meant to be a private conversation. And from that, whether they didn't hear the whole thing or whether it was a chap called Tom Baldwin who wrote the piece, who I believe used to describe himself as a journalist. He's now doing the job that he should be doing, which is a propagandist. Nothing wrong with being a propagandist, but not being a journalist at the same time. Anyway, he, I think, felt that you could do both jobs at the same time in those days. And Tom is now Ed Miliband's Director of Communications. And he wrote the story, and his interpretation of the story was that I had said that, which of course I hadn't. So we had a little bit of the BBC went absolutely bonkers, as you can imagine. I was in a car going to somewhere or other, do a literary festival. I remember when I got the call from my then boss, who said, the chairman thinks you should be sacked. Chairman at the time was Michael Grade. I accused him of that later in the presence of Her Majesty the Queen. You mentioned the Queen earlier. We were together. I mean, Grade and I were talking at some fancy do in BBC. And I said he wasn't any longer the chairman, so I was able to say, you're a right bastard, aren't you, trying to get me sacked? I never did, he said. He did, in fact. But anyway, and the BBC got all worried about it, as you can imagine. And I refused to have any part in it. I wouldn't go to be interviewed by them or do it. And I said, no, sorry, you want to sack me, you sack me. It isn't true, and that's it. You either take me before you don't. Anyway, a couple of days later, the Times printed an editorial, a leader that said, actually, I paraphrase here, but actually he didn't say that, and we're very sorry, and he's a really nice bloke. End of story. But it was a deliberate stitch-up, and there's no doubt about that. It was.
I mean, there's a lot of discussion in journalism about the role of bugging people, catching people on camera, obviously in digital world when we can all do it. How do you feel about that?
Depends who you are and what you've done. I didn't have any problem with them getting hold of the tape. I mean, it seemed a bit silly, and indeed one of the gentlemen involved in that paid a rather large chunk of money to my charity as a result of it. Because I did say I would sue, which I wouldn't have done, obviously. Journalists shouldn't sue, but I thought it was worth a try, and I got a good few quid for my charity, about which I'm going to tell you at the end, whether you like it or not. But I don't know. I mean, look, if I had said that, and they got me banged to right saying that, tough, you know. I shouldn't have said it, and if I was exposed saying it, fine. I wouldn't have been happy, but that would have been fair enough. What I objected to about that was that my words were distorted. Obviously, that's what I objected to. But no, I think if you're asking me whether the sort of thing that happened to Jack Straw and Malcolm Rifkin last week is legit, I don't like it, but equally, I think if you are in a position, or have been in a position of enormous power and influence, I think you must expect that kind of thing to happen to you, and it's down to you to protect yourself against it. And it was perfectly simple for them, wasn't it? We know now, and others did turn down the invitations and smelled a rat. It's a way of getting stories, and I'm not going to say it shouldn't happen. I'm not sure I'd be massively keen on doing it myself, but I'd be no good at doing it anyway. I don't think I'd be awfully effective. But what do you think?
I think I feel the same way as you. Honestly, a bit of a cop-out. It's not something I particularly want to be involved in myself. But
you wouldn't stop it?
Can't take it. No, I can't say I could stop it.
Well, I'd like to ask John what he thinks about it.
Yeah, I'm with you too.
I'm not terribly keen on it, but I can see that it
Has a place.
Has a place, but it's not something I charge around the news encouraging. No, I feel uneasy.
Yeah, that's it. That's the word, uneasy. Yeah.
Well, I'll come back to that. Now, what about your main job, if you like, the Today Inquisitor? What's the attitude to the politicians?
Completely straightforward, and there's no.
You've got to get something out of them, though, haven't you?
Well, yes, but you haven't got. Look, I tell you what the idea, what the dream. You know this. God, you're asking me. I should ask you exactly the same question. And I mean, obviously, you've seen Adam doing his job. He does it bloody brilliantly, and I think he should still be political editor. But there you go. I mean, you know, editor at large sounds much grander, doesn't it? But you know. Whatever. Anyway, he was a great political...
I'm glad I'm asking the question, because I did do a public interview with Ken Livingstone. His open question was, have you ever had sex with animals? So,
And the answer was?
No, but I didn't invent the bendy bus either. But I only thought that afterwards.
Anyway, you know, I mean, it's funny that you're asking me the question you know the answer to. What you dream of, when you do an interview with a senior politician, you want to be able to open the newspapers in the morning. Well, indeed, I'm slightly out of touch, aren't I? But in the old days, open the newspaper in the morning and see that every newspaper was leading with your interview because you really got something out of that interview. Amazing. Or indeed, got to be the lead on the World at One and Sky News throughout the day and all that stuff. That's what you're hoping. You're hoping to break news. Of course you are. That's the business we're in. But you asked about the Today programme specifically. I think it's much broader than that. The remit is the responsibility is much broader than that. And it is to enlighten. This is going to sound so worthy, but there we go. It's to enlighten the audience. It's to give the audience a sense of not just what the government is doing, what power is doing on their behalf, people in power are doing on their own, it's not just politicians, obviously, it's corporate leaders and so on. What is being done on their behalf, that's the first thing, so that they have a fairly clear idea of what they're... In fact, let's use the old inform, educate and entertain. The very first thing you have to do with the interview, it seems to me, is to inform. It works perfectly well. Lord Reith used it, obviously, to describe the remit of the BBC. You could use it to describe an interview as well. You first of all have to inform what's going on. And I promise that if the politician answers that first question openly and straightforwardly, then you move on to the next. We don't, I think, I speak for myself and I know for you, we don't set out to embarrass the politics. That isn't the first thing you do. How am I going to screw this bastard? I don't agree and never did agree with Paxman's line. In fact, it wasn't Paxman's line. It way predated Paxman. Why is that when you interview a politician, you should always be saying to yourself, why is this lying bastard lying to me? I don't believe that at all. I don't approach interviews in the belief that they are lying bastards. Largely because they're not mostly. Partly, it must be said, because if they did lie, they would get caught at some point and they'd lose their job. So it's a matter of self-preservation, but it's also because most of them, I think, I don't know whether you agree with me on this, Adam, I think most of them are decent.
They are trying to do something.
They are, and somebody has to do it. Somebody has to be a politician, yeah? I mean, and I couldn't do it. Well, you, I know I couldn't.
Inevitably, you do fall out with people. I mean, you've got Jonathan Aitken's condemnation of you on the...
Jonathan Aitken was not happy with me. He tried to get me sacked. Jonathan Aitken, who very soon after that ended up in court and in jail. Now, I tried very hard not to celebrate that fact.
What was it he called you? He called you...
He said I had poisoned the well of democratic debate with my style of interview. That's all. That's all.
Not something you'd want on your tombstone.
No. On the other hand, neither would I want on my tombstone to be known as a convicted perjurer for the rest of my life. But there we are. But that's what Jonathan said. And he said it because in an interview, all sorts of things. But I can live with that. I mean, leave people to judge. I tell you what scared me about that was that he made the comments attacked me in a speech on a Friday night in his constituency. So I spent the whole weekend, and it obviously made headlines. It was a big story at the time, and I was scared that he was speaking for the cabinet. I was afraid that the Tory government at the time, obviously. I was afraid that he was the sort of point man and that the cabinet agreed with what he said, and this was the beginning of an attack on me and the BBC style of, all that sort of thing. And so I spent the whole weekend thinking, writing my resignation letter, more or less. And then on Monday morning, Douglas Hurd, Lord Hurd as he is now, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time and a very important figure in the cabinet, made it perfectly clear to my programme by getting somebody to ring in on his behalf, saying he was perfectly happy to come on the programme, and if John Humphrys was interviewing, he'd be even happier. So that was a little strong. And then Ken Clarke, God bless him, went on World at One on that Monday and said, what a load of nonsense, effectively. So it was all right. It didn't damage me.
But there are politicians that you end up having problems with. I mean, Tony Blair, you had a bit of a...
I had a bit of a problem with Tony Blair. Blair went for 4 years without doing a single interview with me when he was Prime Minister. And bear in mind, I knew him, not as well as you, but I knew him well, or fairly well, I thought. And we'd always got on reasonably well when he was in opposition, and then when he became Prime Minister, and it all seemed fine. And then came the day when he... it was the first day of the 2001 campaign, and I was down to interview him. He was up in his place in Sedgefield in his constituency. I was in London, obviously. And I'd agonised over you know what it's like. What's the first question you ask the Prime Minister at the start of an election campaign? Because this one matters quite a lot. And I agonised over it a lot. And I thought that I would ask him about sleaze. And some of you will know that the big issue one of the big issues in the 97 campaign that put Blair into power was what they called Tory sleaze. And the promise that when Labour got into power, there wouldn't be any sleaze. They would be, remember the expression, purer than pure, whiter than white. And they weren't. Within 4 months, was it? 5 months? The sleaze was oozing out of the floorboards, number 10 and everywhere else, and it was really dodgy. Nasty things were happening. Formula One, Bernie Ecclestone, Lakshmi Mittal, and so on and so on and so on. So I thought I would do, as my first question, I would remind him about that. And so I framed a question that went as follows. When you became Prime Minister, you said you were going, before you became Prime Minister, you said you were going to be purer than pure, whiter than white. Have you been? And You don't often want silence on the radio, but that was one where you did. You wanted that. I don't. Do you remember Rory Bremner when he did that wonderful impersonation of Blair? It was the sort of shoulder shrugging bit, and he did that. I couldn't see his shoulders, but I could hear his voice, and he did that sort of. Oh, John, I don't think that's what people want to talk about. Do you? Yeah, if you don't, I do. Anyway, we had one of those interviews, 25 minutes, with he would not answer a single question about sleaze, and I wouldn't let it go, so it was like ships passing in the night. And at the end of the interview, Alistair Campbell was sitting at the table, obviously. You all know Alistair Campbell. And he, my producer, who was up there, told me that Campbell pulled his headphones off his head, threw them across the table, as Alistair was wont to do, with some violence, and uttered just one word: wanker. My producer incidentally said he's never been quite sure to whom he was referring, but anyway, 4 years went by, not another interview, not one more interview.
Now, I've got about 2 more questions before we throw it out to the audience. So,
and then he did start doing interviews again, by the way. So just.
I just want to ask about the period where you and Bob Friend were working together as foreign correspondents, kind of.
Well, we're never quite together because obviously
you're in different places.
You're different places always. But Bob's reputation crossed oceans, I think it's fair to say. I learned a huge amount from him. I mean, filling in expenses. I mean, Bob was a great man. I mean, he really was. He was. We use the word, don't we, all the time? It's overused. He was a legendary figure. He really was. He was massively good fun. Always had a smile on his face, but he had a core of steel, and he was a proper journalist.
But like you, I felt a reporter and not someone who necessarily thought that the lying bastard was always lying.
No. Bob was a decent, fair. He was a good bloke. I mean, John was. I mean, he was a good bloke and bloody good at his job. He really was, because he had. Apart from, he had a rare combination, authority and likability, I think. He wrote well. He did all the things that you needed. He had all the skills that you needed to be a good hack. But he had that other thing that not all that many of us do. He had that kind of likability on air, and he had the presence. And people both warmed to him, I think, and respected him, and listened to what he had to say. I thought he was a brilliant journalist. And
your advice to the younger members of your audience who want to be journalists?
What do you mean, apart from don't? I did tell my older kids that if they even thought about
being bugged,
I warned them not to be. If they wanted to be journalists, I would break both their legs. Because I thought, I wanted them to be something like, it's a long time ago, bank managers or something, safe and uncontroversial. And guess what? My oldest son became a musician. Great. I wanted them to keep me in my old age, not, work on the Penarth Times or something. Anyway, advice, if you are absolutely... Well, a little story, just a very, very short story. When my oldest son was agonizing over what he wanted to do, and at the time, I had a small farm, and he was madly keen about farming, and he sort of agreed, with my encouragement, that he was going to do a degree in agriculture at university. And so we went around the bloody country looking at different universities and things. Came back after 5 or 6 days, and we were having supper that night, and I said, right, which one's it going to be then, Edinburgh or Newcastle or whatever? And those were the days when you could just decide which university you went to and you got in, sort of. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it. I said, what, after all? He said, no, I want to be a cellist, because he played the cello a lot. And Jesus. So I took him to, I happened to know, coincidentally, the guy who was at the time, didn't know him well, but a bit, the principal of the Royal College of Music. And I said, do you mind giving my boy the once over? He said, no, bring him in. Took him in. And he sat down for the audition, and he played his piece, a bit of Bach or whatever it was. And the principal listened. And when he finished, he said, you want some advice? She said, yes, please. He said, don't be a cellist. And my son's face went, And then he paused, did the principal, and said, unless doing anything else would make you very unhappy, And I think that's it. Because look, being a journalist is not, it was easy when I was a kid. It really, well, you heard what happened to me. I mean, it was dead easy. You got a job like that on a local newspaper. You were all, as long as you could read and write and didn't get drunk all the time, you could just about, you would be all right. And there were plenty of jobs going, and nobody ever heard of the internet and all that sort of stuff, and blogging or any, I mean, that was it. It was dead easy to get work. It was reasonably well paid work. You were a member of a then powerful union, and it was a doddle, basically, and it's not any longer. And why am I telling you that? You know that. And getting a decent job in this particular trade, incidentally, I think it's a trade and not a profession, but anyway, is not easy. So my advice would...
You agree with what Andrew Marr with, that it's a trade.
Oh, really? Does Andy say the same?
That's what his book's called, My Trade.
Of course, I'd forgotten that. Yes, absolutely. Sound man, Andrew. So that's my advice, is don't do it unless you really, really would be unhappy doing something else, because it's not easy and it's not going to get any easier. However, if you want it, if you really, really, really want to do it, then it's a fantastic job. I mean, I can't think of a better job offhand. I can't, full stop. But it's been good to me. I've been very, very lucky. I've been in the right place, and that's not false modesty. I've been in the right place at the right time. I've worked with people who have been every bit as competent as me, many of them many times more competent than me, and they haven't had the lucky breaks that I've had. So bear that in mind too. You've not just got to be, it's one of those jobs. It's not like a profession, it seems to me, where, if somebody said, you've got to have a brain operation tomorrow, I wouldn't say, well, yeah, I think he's quite good at that, isn't he? Should we have him do it? Yeah, I've heard he's really good. The first thing you would say is, well, you wouldn't say because it wouldn't arise. It's a silly example in a way, but is he qualified to do it? I mean, I wouldn't want anybody to operate on my brain who didn't have a lot of certificates saying this guy's trained to operate on people's brains. It's not like that in journalism. You can't, even though you will leave this amazingly good course that you're doing here with the right bits of paper and all that, that won't guarantee you a job, and it won't either. And I might, Tim, where is he? Where did he go and sit? And Tim might, I don't know whether Tim would disagree with me on this, but it won't say either this person is capable of being a journalist. It will say you've gone through a very, very important piece of training, for sure, but you don't know until you do it whether you're going to be able to, and it's not like being a doctor or a dentist or an architect or an engineer, where your skills are unique to that profession. Journalism is a trade, but it's not a trade like being a carpenter or a plumber. I wouldn't want my house plumbed by somebody who wasn't a proper plumber. We can all do journalism in our own way. Some of us can do it to a high standard, the standard required by Sky or by a newspaper, a decent newspaper, or whatever it is. But everybody can do a bit of it. We've seen that with the explosion of the internet, obviously. It's not something that is exclusive to a small group of people who have gone through that training. And I know plenty of people who have become brilliant journalists who've never had a day's training in their lives. Well, I never had a day's training in my life, but that's slightly different because I was able to work on local papers, etc., etc., etc. But it isn't one of those jobs where having a qualification really means anything other than you know how it is done, if you take my point. So my advice is think terribly hard. Well, you have already, and you're here, and you're in a good place. I mean, given everything that I've said, this is an awfully good place to start. But you've got to be prepared to work awfully hard. I mean, I was talking to Tim earlier about what we've done, because, of course, Tim, as you will know, worked on the Today programme with me as well. And I tell you, those people, my producers on the Today programme, it's a great job, but you're working your socks off. You're working all night and then off and into the next day, and boom, 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 boom. It's hard work if you're going to do it properly. It's not a doddle. It's much more difficult now than it was when I started, because the competition comes at you from all over the place. Don't do it unless doing something else would make you unhappy.
Okay, now I bought your books in here, which will be available. Some of them, which will be available in the foyer outside afterwards. But tell us a little bit about the Kitchen Table Trust.
Oh, yes, can I do that? Yeah, I set up a charity a few years ago. I wanted, my old man left me a few quid. He was poor, but when his house was sold, there was a few hundred quid. And when he died, he left me 200 quid and the other kids. And I wanted to give it to a sort of charity that I knew he and my mother would have approved of. Couldn't find quite what I was looking for, and they both were decent people who cared about poor kids. And you know, my father went blind when he was 13, and he was concerned about that. Anyway, I wanted to do something with his money that he and my mum, who died years ago, would have approved of. And I went to Tanzania, as it happened, no particular reason. I'd been based in Africa for years, based everywhere. And wanted to set up a school for very poor children, orphans, who had absolutely nothing. And I figured now that education is the cliche, but it is the priceless gift. If you haven't got it, you're stuffed. If you can't read and write, you've got no chance. So I decided to do that, realized after a few days in Tanzania that was stupid, that there are millions of charities doing all sorts of tiny charities, tiny ones. I'm not talking about Save the Children, Oxfam, whatever, talking about charities you've never heard of, I've never heard of, doing absolutely phenomenal things with no money. They've got the local expertise, they know what's needed, they know what's needed to be done, they have the energy, they have the kindness, they have all the things that you would hope for, but they haven't got any money. So I thought I'd set up a website, raise money and give them grants, and that was what I did, but it sort of grew a bit from that, and it's called the Kitchen Table Charities Trust because one of our founding the basis of the thing really is that we do not believe in, we believe that the kind of charity that we're interested in is voluntary stuff. That's to say, we won't give any money to anybody who pays anybody to do things apart from the professionals that are needed, like doctors or teachers, obviously. But my charity, we don't have any offices, we don't have any paid staff. Everybody does things, because they want to do it and they pay for it themselves. And we have a meeting once a year, our trustees around my kitchen table, that's Kitchen Table Charity Trust, and all the charities we give money to, and we've given away about 3 million quid in the last few years, are small grants, enough to enable a village to build a school, or we're particularly concerned with women, or mostly sub-Saharan Africa, only the poorest people, ideally, children who are disabled, orphan, no chance of an education. An important thing, just a small thing, and I could go on forever, but I will stop, I promise you. Something that people tend not to think of, I confess I didn't, was toilets, and the massive, massive, massive importance of toilets in education. If girls will stop going to school at a certain age, unless we're talking about, a typical sub-Saharan African village or whatever, they will go to school maybe, if they're lucky, up to a certain point. They will then stop. When they reach puberty, they will stop. Because what they want, obviously, is a bit of privacy and decent conditions and a bit of hygiene, all that sort of thing. And they will not go. And most schools, at least in the sort of areas that we work in, don't have decent toilets. So you spend money on toilets, which seems an odd thing to do when kids haven't got books or desks, but you spend money on toilets, and then the girls will go to school. And it's little things like that that we do, and wheelchairs, very, very basic, simple wheelchairs. So you get local people to build a wheelchairs, and then it means that, A, the guys get jobs. You train them to build the wheelchairs, the guys get jobs. The woman who has a disabled child is able to go to work because she doesn't have to carry her child around on her back, and the child is able to go to school and get educated. So 3 hits for one. And that's the sort of stuff we do, and as I say, we could bang on forever. So when I flog my books, which I do occasionally, the money goes to charity, and anyway, there we are. So that's the pitch. And if anybody wants to buy a book outside afterwards, I will happily sign it for them and take your money for the charity.
Okay, John, well, thank you for staying up past your bedtime anyway. And we'll now take some questions from the audience. Don't be shy, lady there.
What's your opinion on minority parties taking part?
What's your opinion on minority parties
Taking part in television debates?
I'm sort of, and this is really pathetic, isn't it? But I'm sort of not allowed to say that because I'm part of the BBC, and the BBC's view is what we know it to be. And therefore I have to say, well, I don't think I would, I don't think, and I'm not normally reticent, but I think on this one I've got to be mildly cautious because it would be, it's a live political debate, and I don't get involved in live political debates for obvious reasons, because I've got to be impartial. Can't chair a discussion or interview somebody about this unless I'm seen not to have any views of my own, if you see what I mean. So I'm sorry, it's a terrible thing to have to duck a question. I hate doing it. But in the same way, you know, if you ask me, which I know you wouldn't, but if you ask me who should win the next election, I wouldn't give you an answer to that, of course. And it's not quite at that level, but nonetheless, it's a tricky one for me. I would like to see the debates happen. I don't, for what it's worth, and I think I'm allowed to say this, I don't, for what it's worth, think it is quite as important as some people think it is. I think they do matter. And I thought the last lot worked in some respects and didn't work in other respects. But I would prefer to have them than not have them. But as to whether all the minority parties should line up and whether you'd... Look, I mean, this is easy to say and entirely obvious to everybody in this room. If you have 7 or more people all taking part in a 1-hour programme, just as the Americans say, do the math. I mean, divide 60 minutes, take out adverts or whatever it is. Well, no adverts, I know, but take out the bits and pieces, and you're left, well, let's say you're left with 50, I don't know, John, 50, you'd be left with about 52 minutes or something. Divide that by 7, and then take away the questions, and what each one gets about 4 minutes. I don't know. How far do you get with that? Boom, difficult.
As you know, Sky News and Channel 4 are hoping to do a head-to-head between the 2 main party leaders as well, which is a compliment. Yeah, and the point about it is that the broadcasters have come up with plans to accommodate what the parties, particularly the Conservative Party, have said to us. And the fact that we've now accommodated what they said to us and they still haven't agreed to do the debate, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. Gentlemen there.
Could I just ask a question, please, about tenacity in interviewing? I mean, I wondered whether there are any limits, do you think, in how far you can go with those people who are being elusive and cutting and diving?
Those people who are
being elusive.
Oh, elusive, yes.
Are there any limits as to how far you should go?
Yes, and I have crossed the limit myself on a number of occasions. The obvious limit, hardly need me to say, but the obvious limit is rudeness, and you are not allowed to lose your temper. I have done. I did it a long time ago with a chap called John Hume. You may remember he was a very senior figure in Northern Ireland politics, won the Nobel Peace Prize, in fact. And I lost it with him one morning on the Today programme. It was a long time ago. It was, I think, 25 years ago. And have regretted it ever since. And the audience was utterly furious with me. We didn't have emails then, but we did have letters, and by God, they were delivered in the sackfuls. And yeah, and I learned a lesson the hard way. One has absolutely no right to lose one's temper, or indeed to show that one's... I think you're allowed to show a little bit of irritation. I think that's allowed. But tenacity, there is no limit to tenacity. There is no reason why you shouldn't ask the same question 10 times. I think it's slightly plain to the gallery when you do that, because it's entirely obvious to the audience whether the politician is going to answer the question or not after 2 or 3 or 4 times. So when you keep asking the same question, it becomes, I think, slightly tedious and a bit showing-offy. And God knows we would never dream of showing off, would we? But no limit on tenacity, certainly a limit on, rudeness, I think. And how often, you didn't ask me this, but I'm sure it's part of your question, how often should one interrupt, which is the thing that upsets people mostly. I think, and this may, I don't know whether you experienced this, Adam, but, and anyway, you were, I was going to say you're slightly better behaved. You weren't. You were just as horrible as the rest of us, weren't you, really, when you were doing it?
Well, I mean, I think people, it is what people complain about most, about you interrupting. But what you do tend to notice is that the people who tend to complain about it tend to be party pre.
Yes.
So if they like the Conservative Party,
Yeah.
they complain about you interrupting a Conservative person. Similarly, if they like the Labour Party, they complain that way round. And you know, the truth is, and you know, this is what always strikes me, is the really remarkable thing about the Today programme is how much ground you, and you in particular, managed to cover in the interviews, and you couldn't do that if you couldn't interrupt.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think the thing to bear in mind is, although I don't go along with the lying bastard stuff, I do believe, well, it's obvious, isn't it, that a politician comes onto a programme like Today or any other programme in order to sell a package. That's what they do. And there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't. And if they choose to think of it as democracy wall in Beijing in the 1970s or whatever, fine, that's fine. But they also know that they're going to be challenged. In other words, they're not going to be allowed to do a 7-minute party political broadcast. Left to their own devices, that's what they would do, and I don't blame them. So it's our job to say, hang on, fine, heard what you had to say. Well, there's a sort of unwritten rule that you don't interrupt their first answer. I have to say there were occasions with the late lamented Jack Straw where one didn't necessarily stick to that rule. After 4 minutes of the first answer, you did occasionally think, yeah. But by and large, I think that's a fair sort of little mini rule that one ought to observe. Not rule, but custom, whatever. I think you know it when you've gone too far. I have had plenty of editors in my headphones over the years saying, let him speak. And I realised then, I think I do it rather less now than I used to, but I think maybe there was a time when I was interrupting too much, I think. And I think that I've backed off a bit, or maybe they're just more respectful.
I mean, I find the circumstances in which you do it, if you've got eye contact, it's always much easier.
Hugely important point. Yeah. Yeah.
If you're interviewing someone down the line, whether on television or on the radio, when they can't see you, there is a tendency for people to keep talking because they're nervous, they don't know if there's anyone listening. They keep talking, you've got a limited amount of time, that's when you have to interrupt.
In every respect, eye to eye ones are better, aren't they?
Yeah. And people can't see that very often.
No.
Well, obviously they can't see it on the radio.
Sorry. Yeah.
Next question. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to ask you one particular, because I've been tweeting all night. What is your version and why are you so afraid or not afraid or so able towards Twitter and social media? What did you tweet?
Twitter and social media, what do you think of it?
The assumption was made, if you couldn't hear the point, I suspect you couldn't at the back, the assumption is made, and I'll come back to the assumption in a moment, that I have, and your word was an aversion to Twitter and social media. I don't. That is one of those myths. The fact that I don't tweet has got nothing to do with my aversion to it. I can see the benefits of it, and I can understand why an awful lot of people do it. If you were to ask me a slightly different question, like, for instance, how much do I think tweeting contributes to the public debate, I would say not as much as many people think. So I'd be a complete idiot to suggest that it contributed nothing. Of course it does. But I am a bit, and I hate the word, but I'll use it anyway, conflicted, because a lot of it is why am I telling you this? You know this 100 times better than me. A lot of it is entirely vacuous and entirely pointless, and some of it highly meretricious, and some of it downright offensive. So I have that problem with it. And of course, it's unmediated. And I believe that the one thing that good journalism must be, all of it, without exception, is in one way or another, in one shape or another, mediated. I have editors sitting above me, thank God, who make decisions about me and what we do that I don't have to make because I know somebody. An editor has a newspaper has an editor. If it didn't have an editor, it wouldn't be, and so on and so on. So there has to be, news has to be mediated. So long as we don't regard Twitter as a reliable source of information, point one, or a necessarily accurate reflection of the public mood, point two, And so long as we are prepared to say more often than we do say at the moment, what a load of bollocks. Point 3, I have no problem with Twitter at all. As for why I don't do it, I haven't got time. I don't know where I would fit in that extra, what? If it were only 5 minutes of the day, it would be completely pointless. It seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, that you have to do it regularly to make it worth doing at all, yeah? I mean, if I started doing it, I did the other day, this is a precautionary tale, about 3 or 4 months ago, I wanted to find out what people were saying on Twitter about whatever it was. I was writing something, whatever, I can't remember the details. And I went into the Twitter website, and it has to be said that I'm not absolutely brilliant at handling all technology. Not right up there with you, I dare say. And I managed, please don't laugh, I managed to sign up to Twitter. Yeah, and I didn't know that I'd done that. And I was in my office when all this happened, obviously. I went down, I had lunch, I came back from lunch, logged on, and it was my worst night. I don't know, I'd given them my email or something, I don't know. Anyway, my email, Jesus, the inbox was just thousands, and it was all the sort of, oh, Humphrys has signed up, oh, you know. Anyway, I panicked. I got someone in the office to unsign me immediately. But you know what? I've got a 14-year-old. My youngest kid is 14. My oldest is 48. He is complete, and his friends are completely uninterested in Twitter. Completely, yeah. All of his group, and I mean all of his year, and the year above him, and he thinks the year above him as well. I mean, he's less clear about what the 17-year-olds in his school do. But certainly 14s, 15s, 16s, Twitter doesn't exist in their universe, which I think is interesting. I mean, I'm not suggesting they don't do all sorts of other stuff. They do, of course. But social media, immensely valuable in all sorts of ways. You can't imagine the world without it, which is a blindingly obvious, banal thing to say, isn't it? But I think we have to be awfully careful about the assumptions we make insofar as its value to journalism are concerned. We have to be very, very cautious, and also aware that it can be manipulated and is manipulated. What do you think, Adam?
Well, I bear out what you're saying about the people using Twitter being a particular market. I mean, I was in a comprehensive school the other day speaking to 14 to 18-year-olds. Not one of them was on Twitter.
Oh, really? 14 to 18?
In fact, not one of them read a newspaper either. But small percentage, about 12%, I suppose, did actually listen to radio and television news. So I felt that it was getting through. But I mean, they use WhatsApp and all the other things. I mean, my feeling about Twitter is that it is a useful information source, but largely as a shop window. Yes. I mean, my greatest use is it tells me about things that people have written or whatever, and that's the basis.
Do you tweet?
Yes, I do. And the basis on which I do it is I don't actually say anything that I don't think I could say on air. Some of the things I might say a bit more true. So that is how I mediate it, if you like, exactly. in terms of controlling it.
That's self-mediation. Yeah.
And you do hear things. Nonetheless, there is a side to it of human nature. I mean, the stuff yesterday with our friend Nick Robinson getting cancer. The fact that people were making jokes about that or said serves him right, or he could do with some chemotherapy. I mean, I find that astonishing and horrible.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at. Yeah, that's quite. And there wasn't a vehicle for that before, was it? Well, poison pen.
Well, you could write to the paper, but the paper probably wouldn't print it. So,
exactly. How many of you tweet? Hands up. How many of you don't? Well, more than I'd expected then. Right, that's interesting. What, can I just ask, do you mind? Those of you who don't, assuming you're not as old as me, well, nobody's as old as me, assuming you're not as old as me, why do you not? Who put your hand up and didn't? Yeah, why do you not?
I don't think it's relevant to what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what was fascinating about go to news source, that's what I'll go for.
Do your friends think you're weird for not tweeting?
Yeah, really.
Well, good on you.
Anyone else who's found out on tweeting? Yeah.
Am I the only one who finds it very confusing?
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Using Twitter, am I the only one finding it very confusing? The little hashtags and the it's very confusing.
Lady there, you
Me?
Yeah.
No, I think it's my impression, because I'm from Norway, and before I moved there, no one had Twitter, and never had. They only
No Twitter in Norway at all?
Yeah, of course you have it, but it's not used at all.
But it's not used, eh?
I use it here because I feel like kind of feel like I have to, and I want to get used to it. But I only use it when I'm in England, never anywhere else.
All right, can I ask one more question then? Then I'll stop. How many of you who put your hand up to say you use it, how many of you use it because you feel you have to use that expression? How interesting. Yeah, yeah. Look, including your distinguished professor there. Well. What? What? Right.
Yeah, I was just going to ask John about the format of the day programme, which hasn't changed since the days of Brian Redhead and probably before that. And I just wondered, you still have Talk of the Day at the same time and papers. I just wondered, can that endure when everything else is changing in the industry? 20 years' time, when obviously you're still presenting. Some of the students here are taking their place. Are we still going to be playing the Queen's national anthem?
Oh, don't get me started on that. I mean, the Queen you can just about tolerate, but when it's other members of the Royal Family, I didn't say that. Do you know what? When they asked me to join the Today programme, 29 years ago.
It was a call you got at midnight.
It was exactly that. I was presenting, reading the 9 o'clock news on BBC One in those days. The 9 o'clock news used to be at 9 o'clock. Well, obviously it did. Not 10 o'clock. The evening news used to be on that. And I got back about midnight, yeah. It was late night. And there was a phone call from the Today programme saying, do you want to come and be a presenter? And I said yes, without even saying how much, which is how keen I was to do it. And I was bored rigid with news reading anyway. Not a job for a grown boy, I thought. Sorry, Hugh. What was the... Yeah. And what they said to me when I went to have lunch with the editor to talk about it was, I said, why me? And they said, well, you've got a bit of a profile because you've been a foreign correspondent, a bit of experience, you've been newsreading, all that stuff. But, I know this sounds very difficult, very hard to imagine, but you are young. I was, actually, at one point.
28 years ago.
It was 28 years ago, and I was quite, well, all right, I wasn't old. Anyway, much younger than Archibald. And the programme has to change, and we're going to change it. And we want you to be part of that change, and you're going to be that. And you're right, it hasn't changed, except that it has. It's changed in all sorts. The difference, John Timpson, and I took over from John Timpson. You'll remember him when he presented with Brian Redhead, obviously, and it was a great duo, Timpson and Redhead. And I took over from them, from John. John would go into the studio every morning armed with little cuttings, usually from the Daily Telegraph, usually from the Peterborough column, which died a very long time ago, of little, what he used to call ho-hos. And at various points in the programme, he would read out a ho-ho. Now, imagine that today? Don't think so. And so on and so on. We had not that long ago, we had a keep fit instructor on the Today programme. Yeah? Still think it's the same? And I could give you another dozen examples like that. I think it has changed. Now, what we've done, and I think they've been quite clever about, is it has been incremental change. The audience goes apeshit if you do anything fundamental. They really do. I mean, you talk about thought for the day. Some of us, I include myself, have been trying to get rid of thought for the day for the last, well, in my case, forever.
28 years.
Really, but even before I joined the programme. And I would still get rid of thought for the day. I would try to keep, for what it's worth, if you're interested, I would try to keep some sort of column, as it were, some sort of opinionated section where people with they'd have to qualify, they'd have to meet certain criteria, would be able to express their views for a minute and a half or 2 minutes or something, certainly not 3.25 minutes. But the idea that you may do this only if you are a believer is preposterous. Why shouldn't atheists be allowed to express their views?
Your new editor, the first thing he said was, thought for this day is staying.
Yeah, quite. Anyway, we thought Roger Mosey was who Tim will know very well indeed was my editor for a long time, and we talked about this. He wanted to get rid as well, and what we thought we would do was we'd have a survey, not as common then as they are now, but we would survey the audience, confident in the knowledge that they'd go like that to Thought for the Day. And they'd say maybe give a bit more time to sport or whatever it was. Because that was the way people... God, what a mistake. Don't touch Thought for the Day. I tell you, when we decided to cut 30 seconds out of it, they were marching on Broadcasting House. Well, Radio 4 listeners don't really march, they sort of amble. And the last demonstration of Radio 4 listeners outside Broadcasting House, they were so nice, they came in for a cup of tea. But it changes, trust me, it really has changed. I think it's changed quite a lot over the years, but the basis, you're quite right, the basis remains. And I don't think, God, what a hostage to fortune this is, because you will all have your own, if you listen to it, brilliant ideas as to how it should be made better, apart from getting rid of presenters. I think, well, look, we get 7 million audience. When I joined, I'd like to say it was a direct result. There were 1 or 2 other factors involved. When I joined, it was 4. It's increased from 4 million, slightly less than 4, it was 3.8. 4, who's remembering? It's gone up and up and up. It's gone down a bit, but it's a steady trend. We're now sort of settled at the moment anyway, around 7 million. So, they'll be doing something right, I think.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So, gentlemen there.
Can I ask a question to all 3 of you? I just wanted to push you on something that came up earlier in your joint discussion about, you were all surprisingly lily-livered, I thought, about Straw and Rifkin's story and whether you thought that was a justifiable journalistic tactic. Why? And
why is it justifiable?
Why were you so anxious about it? And I guess my follow-up to that is, do our broadcast institutions break enough stories, or do you just tend to leave that to the newspapers and follow?
Well, one word to you, really, panorama. Over the last few weeks, HSBC, I'd have thought that wasn't a bad story. But you're right, and if my hugely respected and distinguished and good-looking and sexy well, wonderful human being who just happens to be my boss, James Harding, were here, he would applaud you at that stage, because he would say that's exactly what's wrong with the BBC. We've got all these journalists, thousands and thousands and thousands on, we don't break enough stories. And that's his great ambition, is that we should, that's his biggest aim, I suppose, is that we should break more stories. I don't agree with that as a guiding principle. I think still the number 1 priority for the BBC should be to deliver accurate, this is going to sound amazingly pompous, but nonetheless, to deliver news that is as accurate as it possibly can be, as timely as it possibly can be, and as well judged and measured as it can be. That's our first, because all the rest of, democracy doesn't work unless people are well informed. I mean, it's such an obvious thing to say, I'm ashamed to say it, but nonetheless, that's the point of journalism, to inform people who would otherwise not know about things that they should know about. That's what it is all about. Now, breaking stories is a big part of that. I think it's always going to be the case that newspapers and other organisations will break stories that we do not break, partly, the BBC I mean, partly because, and you'll find this a silly thing to say, in a way it's easier for them. We have to be, HSBC was fine, but the number of occasions when the BBC has stepped over the line with investigations and didn't get it quite right and were absolutely ripped apart for it, rightly ripped apart for it. There haven't been many of them, but by God, they're seared into the BBC's consciousness. If a newspaper does it, it shrugs and gets on with the next, because it doesn't have the same responsibility that the BBC does. I think the BBC has a particular, well, obviously it has a particular responsibility, that goes without saying, but it's such an overwhelmingly powerful obligation that you have to apply slightly different standards. I know every journalist in the land will say, I want to get the story right. And I'm sure they mean it when they say it. The BBC has to get the story right. And if there's any doubt, you have to apply, you have to apply a slightly more rigorous standard to the BBC. So it's inevitably going to be a bit more difficult. The other thing is that we use licence payers' money. It's not a proprietor's money, it's not shareholders' money even, although obviously in the case of Sky, it's got a different set of responsibilities, equally onerous in many ways. But you can spend a massive amount of money pursuing a story and getting absolutely nowhere. And you have to be able to justify that to the licence fee payer ultimately. And that's worth bearing in mind, I think. It might be worth it, it might not be. And I can think of quite a lot of money that has been spent on doing stories that probably would benefit of hindsight. So we've got those two constraints on us. One is that we have to be saintlier than the saints in the sense of getting it absolutely bang to rights. And two, we have to be careful how we spend the licence payers' money. So if I was slightly cautious about it, but I think it's a slightly different point, the investigation thing. The other one, I would simply just repeat John's word, uneasy about it. Entrapment is always a difficult area, isn't it? I mean, there's a special section of law that allows for entrapment and another that, it's a tricky area. So I certainly wouldn't argue against ever doing it, but you've got to be awfully sure.
I would just briefly place that the problem with the Rifkin story was, to me, is that it is entrapment. That, if you film someone kicking away in an old people's home using a covert camera, they're doing it. Even the original Sunday Times Cash for Questions, those MPs were often cash and asked questions, and they're called. But to invent a company and to tempt someone in that way, and for them not to even do it, it just seems to me that it's all rather inconclusive and it's crossing quite a lot of lines. On the exclusive point, take a bit of risk with John in front of me, but I think a lot of rubbish is talked about the electronic media and exclusives for two reasons. First of all, John and the Today programme, they get exclusives every day, and the exclusives they get every day are by getting the people there and asking them the questions and getting them to say things they haven't done before. That is the way in which we get exclusives. And some of the things that comes across as a newspaper exclusive, you simply couldn't say on television, or on radio, I can exclusively reveal that the government is going to change the colour of traffic lights because I had lunch with the Transport Minister. No one will give a stuff if you said that on television. And unless you can get them to say it on the record, it doesn't work. So I think I think you're still reporting, I agree with John, but I think it's a different sort of medium. I think it's using the power of your medium to get access and to break stories in that way, often in a way that people don't notice necessarily. So, I get a little bit hot under the collar that, everyone is somehow, doing the scoop. Actually, I think the first task is to report and to record and to get people on the record. I agree with that. And that, I think, is what television and radio do better than anything else.
Totally agree with that.
And maybe rather a simple point, but and John sort of alluded to it, serious investigations for particularly daily broadcast news require an awful lot of time.
Yeah.
And we had about 11, 12 years ago, we sent a very brilliant journalist, Stuart Ramsey, off into the African jungle to track down some evil terrorist. He was there for about 9 months. Did he get the interview? No. Had he spent thousands of pounds of money? Yes. And we work on a limited number of reporters, a particular budget, and if you're in unlike Panorama in Sky News, we're about daily news. You have to manage your resource accordingly.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And you don't have a few billion quid of licence payers' money to do it with. Yeah.
But we do have tremendous resources, not as much as the BBC, but we've still got resources, and that's where we can focus. And I think, you know, what we haven't talked about this evening is big data and what you can do with digital information, which I think is, you know, as we've already seen from WikiLeaks and elsewhere, is going to be a massive part of journalism in the future. But none of us quite know how you work that into the mediums in which we're working.
Yeah, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. You know,
I was wondering what you thought about the Hutton report.
The Hutton report.
What you just said and the Gilligan story. I think you were on the Today programme.
I was. I did the interview with Gilligan at 7 minutes past 6 on that famous morning. And I have to tell you that I think this is fair to say, I don't think any of us, including Andrew, realised what we were doing at the time. I certainly didn't, because at 7:30 that morning, we certainly, I was doing the 7:30 slot as well, and it wasn't the Gilligan story, it was another story, and I can't remember exactly what it was. It was an Iraq-related story.
I was in Iraq with Blair. And
that's it. Blair
they thought that was the story, and the Secretary of State had said something.
That's it. That's it. And we did sort of touch on the Gilligan thing, and when Campbell said later, what you'll remember it, Adam, it was the shot that rang around the world or something. Yeah. In 24 hours, it had gone around the world, and it was going to destroy Blair and the British government and all the rest of it. Bollocks! Campbell wasn't even aware of it properly until, what was it, 4 days later or something? And then, but what did I think of it in terms of its importance or of what Hutton said? I thought what Hutton said was utterly disgraceful. And had it been allowed to stand unchallenged, it would have been the end of BBC journalism. That's how serious I thought. On the day that the Hutton report was published, I did something I never do, and I went into the office. I mean, I go into the office to do the programme and all that, but when I finished, and I tend not to go back in. But I did on that day, for obvious reasons. It was the day it was being published at lunchtime, at 2 o'clock, I think it was. And we sat there in the Today office, and indeed the whole newsroom, surrounded by the whole newsroom, and we watched the were you there, Tim?
No, I was writing.
Yes. Anyway, we sat there watching the monitors, and we were rocked. I mean, the place was, it really was. It was dramatic. Every 10 minutes or something, there would be another sensational development. The first thing that happened was the chairman of the BBC resigned. Just like that. Hour or two later, the Director General of the BBC resigned. Just like that. We really did believe, and then Campbell made that appalling speech at the bottom of the FCA steps, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Calling for
terrace,
for those who hadn't resigned to be sacked, including me, as I recall. All I did was the interview. Anyway. And we really did believe that the BBC's journalism had been so damaged that it would never recover. If people believed what Gilligan, what the Hutton report said, and then 12 hours later, newspapers started coming out, and they, fortunately, took a different view from his lordship, and regarded it as a whitewash of government, which of course it was. And from then on, things picked up, and I think the general view, ultimately, was the BBC had done what it was required to do. Gilligan didn't get everything right, of course, as he admitted, but he got the guts of it right. Yeah. And but it was a tense.
I mean, it was a real education in power and government, because I sat through a lot of the hearings, and at the end of it, everyone giving their evidence, they were asked, would there be any lessons drawn? And everyone else, the BBC, intelligence services, all said, well, someone's died as a result of this, and we'd just like to express our regrets and our promise that we'll learn any lessons that are necessary. Campbell, Hume, Blair, Jeff Hume didn't say that. They were asked, have they anything more? They said, no, I don't think so. And what we'd missed was the way in which it was framed. It wasn't an inquiry, it wasn't an investigation, it wasn't dealing in greys. Lord Falconer and Tony Blair, and everyone says that the Blair administration was a government of spin doctors. It wasn't. It was a government of lawyers. They knew exactly what they were doing. They framed it, and they wanted to find who was guilty. That was the task which Brian Hutton had. They realised that. We all didn't. We all conceived points and all that.
Yeah.
And basically, at the end of it, he said, if there hadn't been that broadcast, then none of this would have followed. Therefore, I find the BBC guilty, which to a certain extent was a complete misunderstanding of the whole thing.
Deliberate?
But, no, I think they chose him to do a particular job, and they knew that he was that type of lawyer and he would do that job. And it was very interesting for us because, you know, we're competitors, but nonetheless you find yourself effectively allied with the BBC in trying to make those points while you're trying to report at the same time.
All good, but can't I, John, ask you, if you're going to accuse the government of lying to take the country to war, and you are the editor of the Today programme, as Kevin Marsh then was, you actually need to know, don't you, what Andrew Gilligan is going to say to John Humphrys just after 6 o'clock. And the fact that he didn't rather undermine the BBC's position. I agree with everything you said about Hutton, it's what I wrote at the time, but you don't make that accusation casually. You have it in the news bulletin, you've thought about it, and you've actually scripted the answers, because that avoids making mistakes.
Hard to argue with that. That also? Is
biggest victim.
He should have known what Gilligan was going to say. There is no doubt about that. Andrew, is a brilliant reporter, utterly driven, and usually, well, I can't speak now because I haven't worked with him for many years, but impervious to bosses. He regards bosses and editors and people like that as being, I was going to say a necessary encumbrance, actually just an encumbrance. I think the people who kind of get in the way of him doing what he does. And in many ways, that's admirable. But somebody like him deserves, should be carefully controlled. Yes, I would agree with that. And it should not have happened the way it did. Yeah, I completely accept that. And have you read, of course you've read Kevin's book. It's actually quite persuasive, but yes, that sits there all the way through the book, doesn't it? Yeah.
I'm afraid on that note we are going to have to end. We're past the Today programme into sort of Melvin Bragg's time. I think. I would just like to thank John Humphrys very much indeed for giving this Bob Friend.
Well, but also, look, he's the man. He's I tell you what, he is an adornment to the journalistic scene. I really mean that. He's a great man.
Thank you.